this morning.
Thank you. I have a question. How many husbands started sweating when Pastor Andy... I looked directly at my wife, and she was acting like she was going to stand, and that was not funny. Before we get into the word this morning, I got to get a little honest and a little real with you, and I may get a little emotional. This message has probably been one. I'm okay. It's probably been one of the hardest messages I have ever prepared for. And it wasn't making a whole lot of sense to me. Because it's pretty straightforward. I'm speaking, I felt the Lord tell me, you wanted me to speak on David and Goliath. And I'm thinking, what in the heck could make me so emotional about a kid killing a giant? And I think part of the reason why is there was a lot of things in me that I had believed about myself that weren't true. Things I had come to accept and just roll with as if they were part of who I was and my identity. And I think that God was doing a lot of breaking in me as I sought Him and I read through this passage. And I believe this message is way bigger than me. I mean, it's a weight on my shoulders, and it's bigger than me. It's bigger than our pastoral staff, and it's bigger than you, because it's a truth that breaks bondage. And I believe a lot of us have fallen into some bondage today, and I'm going to help you identify that. And I pray that the Lord will reveal to you what He revealed to me. So with that, can we stand with the reading of the Word this morning? We'll be reading from 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 40 through 44. And then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for him 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's bag in a pouch, which he had in his sling, and a sling in his hand. As he drew near to the Philistine, so the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about David and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. And so the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Thank you. May the Lord add His blessing to the reading of the word. You may be seated. Beloved, we walk the land of giants. And if you're having trouble believing that, or you struggle with that idea, hear me out. I believe that once we get through the day, you will recognize that we do, in fact, walk a land full of giants. And the way I saw this, I don't think that I've ever seen this before. I haven't heard it talked about it in this way. And so I'm a bit excited, and I'm a bit worried that I'm not going to do what the Lord said justice. So please be praying for me here. As we look at these scriptures, we're going to see their truth, their promise, and their warnings. And taking those ingredients and applying them to our lives, we are going to come through better. And we're going to come through encouraged. But we've got to expose what these giants are. What are giants? Well, we read in 1 Samuel chapter 17 that Goliath of Gath was a champion of the Philistine army. Now, I don't want to get into the study of Nephilim this morning because Goliath was a Nephilim. There's a lot in the scriptures that talk about them. It's really interesting if you're into sci-fi and fantasy and things. But I'm just going to give you the basis, a few foundational scriptures involving Nephilim. I'll take you to Genesis 6, verses 6. When mankind began to multiply on the earth and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they took any of these as they chose as wives for themselves. And the Lord said, "My spirit will not remain with mankind forever, because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth both in those days and afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind, who bore children to them. They were powerful men of old. They were famous men." And in 2 Samuel 21:15 through 22 talks about even more giants within the Philistine army that were related to Gath. Some were his sons and some were his brothers. Numbers 13:32 gives us an account of Canaan, the promised land, where the spies were sent out to survey the promised land, and they said that this land was full of giants, that they were so big they were like grasshoppers in their sight. Now, there's so much more scripture, beloved, that speaks on giants and the conflicts Israel had with them. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't have a lot of time to go through this, nor do I completely understand just how Nephilim were born. I wish it was as easy as when two giants love each other, they come together and they start a family, but it's not. And it's not really important for us to understand the how this morning. I'm more interested in finding out about the who and what these giants were about. Now, as I alluded to earlier, I was really blown away by the story of David and Goliath as I looked into it. The more I studied it, then as the narrative introduces us to this dire situation, I want to point out a few things that you may have missed or overlooked when it comes to what exactly was transpiring between the Philistine army and Israel's army. We have two conflicting armies facing off in this valley, if you will, two hills. And they're bantering back and forth. And we read that Goliath comes forth and starts to banter and berate them and mock them 2 times a day for 40 days. Now, these numbers are important because they reveal to us that Goliath was harassing Israel during the very times of day they set aside to pray to God, both in the evening and both in the morning. So the very times that Israel was drawing close to God, that it was supposed to be a time of worship and reflection and encouragement, this big bruiser gets out and starts to mock them and makes it extremely hard for them. How many of you have found yourselves trying to do your devotions and you are barraged by thoughts and barraged by bad feelings and you just can't get your head through it? Has that ever happened to you? Well, that's what's happening to Israel in this time. And the second number here we need to look at is 40. Now, the number 40 is very important in the Bible because it is always related to times of testing. Jesus went into the desert for 40 days. It rained on earth for 40 days and 40 nights. The Israelites wandered the desert for 40 days, and there's many more examples. 40 equals a time of testing. So they were being tested, literally, in this time. In order to better prepare ourselves to face giants, we need to take a look at their tactics and their appetites. So here we have Israel being tested yet again, and many of us are right there with them. The army has gathered themselves against us. They've brought their champions forth, and they're mocking us. They send forth their champion. They see unhindered victory. They want to destroy us. They send their champions to bring destruction and doom, and suddenly we find ourselves feeling very powerless. Like we don't have what it takes, like we're overwhelmed. So sure of the giant Goliath is of his victory, he starts monologuing. We see him say, "Why have you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine and you aren't the servants of Saul?" See, Goliath was drawing their attention to scriptures, to what Israel believed about itself. Israel was the chosen people of God. He knew that. And so he was drawing their attention and mocking, challenging their faith. So he's basically asking them, where's your faith? Do you really believe what you preach? Do you practice what you preach? You see, if you pay a close attention here, the Goliath is doing a very peculiar thing. He is getting Israel to take their eyes off of God and on to him. You see, giants are extremely tactful and sly in their approach to us. They're not big and dumb like some of the films show them to be. The enemy was getting Israel to take their eyes from God to the giant. Because giants get us to focus on our situations instead of our Savior, so that we give up our stations, our security, and our service. When we take our eyes off of God to the giant, we become blinded to the presentness of God and his willingness to be in the fight. We get so caught up with that which confronts, confounds, and contests us that we forget he who confirmed, consigns, and covers us. Our eyes are moved from the Savior to the storm, and we begin to sink in the shadow of giants. Reading further from verse 4, and a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of that coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had a bronze arm in his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of the spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron head weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. That's a big man. You see, giants, Goliath, giants, they work tirelessly to sell us our defeat and convince us of their victory, even before the fight has begun. We've lost before we've even stepped foot on the battlefield. Once giants have gotten our attention, we allow them to dictate to us the conditions for victory. We read in verse 8, choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then we shall be your servants and we shall serve us. You see, giants will do whatever they can to keep us distracted, discredited, disqualified, and deceived, to defy God's plans, to deny God's promises, and to destroy God's integrity. They want us to doubt God. I'm going to let that sink in. Do you feel that way this morning? Are your situations trying to get you to convince something true about God that is not true? Are they in conflict with what you know of God's faithfulness? Every bit of what I just said is evident in the scriptures here. We've already witnessed how giants get us to look at them, their armor, their weapons, their armies, in hopes of deterring our eyes from them to God. But let's see exactly how do they discredit and how do they disqualify us. Verse 41, so the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. I'm going to stop right there. Now I'm thinking to myself as I read this, okay, here's probably one of the biggest guys these guys have ever seen. He's armed to the teeth with weapons, bigger than most of the men there, and he has to send his shield bearer out before him to meet David. Maybe there was something there that we weren't aware of. Maybe Goliath was in fact a coward, but let's get back to that. And then the Philistine looked up about and saw David. He disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking, and the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. You see, Goliath, giants, intended for David or us to feel discredited and disqualified because of his lack of experience or of his equipment or lack of equipment. David hadn't seen war. His hands weren't trained from battle. They weren't calloused from battle. He wasn't accustomed to the chaos of war, the blood and the dust and the screams of giant men like most of the men there. For all intents and purposes, Goliath was correct. But not only was he correct, the things he said were correct about David. These things were also echoed from the men around David, men whom he trusted. If we go further back a few verses, we observe David's interaction with his own brothers, his own family, and his countrymen, even his king. His brothers accuse him and challenge his motives. They say, and with whom have you left those sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and your insolence of heart, for you have come to see the battle. In other words, you've come to make fun of us or to gloat over us. It's like they were saying, you weren't made for this, boy. You're better suited for other things. You're better suited for the ordinary. His king even doubts him. David goes into Saul's tent, and Saul draws attention to his faults and shortcomings. In verse 33, and Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. Man, to hear that from someone you trust, that's hard. Have you ever been there? Have you ever sought encouragement and found the opposite? I wonder how many of us can relate to David here. David's righteous anger had been stirred up. It had been aroused. He feels convicted and conflicted to do something about it, only to find ridicule and resentment instead of reception and reinforcement. How many of us have set out to do what we believe the Lord's will is? How many of us have set out to do what we are conflicted about and what we are convinced about? And we get this feeling and burden on our shoulders only to find the same thing, only to hear that we're not qualified. Sometimes it's the giant, sometimes it's the opposition, sometimes it's internal, and sometimes it's the very people we hold closest to us. You see, I love what David does, though, in the midst of all this. Because David, in order to remind himself and to realign himself with a proper perspective, does this. Look at this in verse 34. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion and a bear came and took the lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and caught it by the beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." Moreover, David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me of the hand of the Philistine this day." Because David had discovered two powerful truths. One, there will always be opposition that sets itself against the flock of God. The enemy will always oppose the promises and prophecies of God. He will always set himself against momentum made in Christ. He will always do it. Expect it. It's going to happen. And in two, though the enemy may change its size, its stature and strength, that the victorious hand of God does not change, concede, or cower. God was with him in his trials. God preserved and saved him in the little things, and he will preserve and save him in the big things. David recalls what trials, testings, and tribulations he faced before. More importantly, he recalled who it was that brought him through and who delivered him in the past. David's response to the enemy of the flock was to always to engage and was always to eliminate. One might even say that these testings, these previous trials and tribulations, were necessary in preparing David for his confrontation and conflict with Goliath. Without them, beloved, without them, he had missed out. Without them, he would not have the context to see the power of God manifested in the protection of the flock. His faith would have never had the opportunity to grow. His faith would have never had the opportunity to be opposed, contested, and resisted, and he would never experience the faithfulness of God come through despite all of those things. You see, God would never have the opportunity to be manifested in the proximity of David's problems, in the presentness of his urgency. An answer in a time of dire need when all he thought was lost. David had both committed and he submitted himself to the Lord's work because he had received, he believed, and conceived God's will and plans in his heart. Nothing could change that. They were solid. They were deep in there in his heart. And it's because he internalized the promises God prophesied over him for his future that he was empowered to confront that which threatened him in the present. Didn't matter what got in his way. Bear, lion, giant. David knew what God called him to do. David knew the promises of God and believed them to be true. So they were just one more step towards the victory that in which would glorify the Lord as God. It was one less thing for him to conquer. But when we live opposite a life of David, when we cower from conflict, something very unfortunate happens. You see, when we live a life in the safety of the ordinary, in the familiarity of what is commonplace, and the company of daily acquaintance and comforts of the mundane, we rob ourselves of the opportunity to bear witness to the fierceness of God's presence through redemptive trials. It is his most powerful method for unleashing the untapped righteous fury that dwells deep within our miry souls, begging to be set free and like gold, discovered and refined. It longs both to respond to the hearkening Savior's cry and to silence the propagandist agendas hell-bent on diluting our faith, compromising our values, and defacing our legacies. That's what it's after. It's not just about you. Because faith untested is a faith likely bested. So now we turn back to David. Our eyes turn to this young warrior as he faces yet another enemy that set itself against the flock of God and the promises of God. And I found something interesting here, beloved. I found that David left his father's flock to go attend his own flock, the people of Israel, because at this point David had already been anointed king of Israel. It happened a few chapters back, and in the midst of God looking over his brothers. You see, men whom according to the world standards were better equipped, better suited for the job. But the value of these men was measured in their stature, their strength, and their stamina, and these are not God's standards. Let's look at 1 Samuel 16, 6 through 7. And when they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. This is Samuel. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees, and looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Outward appearance, beloved, is the standard of measurement the world uses to validate value, victory, and virtue. They're the things that man hold dear. Outward appearance is everything the world tells us or tries to sell us we are lacking. It's what the world, our enemies, our circumstances, mistakes, our shame, shortcomings get us to measure ourselves against. It's what our enemy wants us to look at to as our standard, because we will always come up short. We can never measure up to that. We will always come up wanting and lacking. What we see David here is again being discounted, discredited, and disqualified. But we are assured that God does not use the same standard of measurement. How often, when left alone to our own devices, do we entertain such thoughts? There's no way I could do this. If only I was like so-and-so. If only my faith looked like this or looked like that. If only I was as spiritual as my wife, or if only I was as spiritual as my husband. My faith doesn't look like that. I'm guilty of that. I'm guilty of measuring my faith and my value up against others. Imagine what David was going through in his mind at this time. He's sitting here as the oil drips over his head and on his shoulders, and he's got to be thinking, surely. I mean, look at my brothers. They're so much more qualified than I am when looking upon the world standards. You see, such thoughts downplay our strengths while exaggerating our weaknesses as we compare those same weaknesses to the strengths of others. That is a battle you will always lose. This is to ensure we always come up short, that we believe we are powerless. We're powerless. You can't do that. If only you had such and such strengths, then maybe you'd be able to do that. Can you relate this morning? It leaves us with our eyes cast down, with bent backs and shoulders slumped. We've lost the battle even before it's began, and I'm challenging that this morning. I'm challenging that notion. Winning this battle, it's important because we're not only fighting for us, we're fighting for everything we hold dear. We're fighting against the enemies of an almighty God that have set themselves up against hindering God's promises, prophecies, and purposes for our lives. The enemies of God want your faith, they want your family, and they want your future. And they will not stop until they get them. Giants have large appetites. Giants want to devour us and enslave our legacy. They want to thwart God's plan, block his promises, and blind us to God's presence. They stand in our way, blocking our progress, our promise, and our potential by getting us to believe we are powerless. We don't have what it takes. And they can only do this, though, beloved, if we allow them to capture our attention, to captivate us, to neglect the very things God has put in us that will play a part in their destruction. I'm going to say this again. They only do this when they can only do this when we allow them to capture our attention and get us to neglect the very things God has put in us that will play a part in their destruction. And we'll get back to this in just a moment, because that is a very powerful statement. The very things they mock you for could be the very things that play a part in their destructions. You see that there's a battle standard. And this is God's standard. The standard we measure ourselves will either play a part in our victory or they will play a part in enabling our defeat. David did not let their standard become his standard. A battle standard, beloved, is a sign that soldiers would hold in the midst of warfare. It had colors and signs and insignias, and they reminded who they were, the soldiers, who they were and what they were fighting for. It was the standard of the king. And it didn't matter if the enemy had standards because they didn't need to pay attention to those. That did not represent them. What represented them was the guy in front of them with the flag of the king. You get what I'm saying? That is the standard of God. That's why we're fighting. Their standards weren't God's standards. God has purposely equipped David, and God had prepared David to face Goliath in that day. God wanted David to use his equipment. Verse 38, Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. And then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these. I have not tested them. As I read this, it really hit me between the eyes. In fact, I wept a little bit. Because God does not expect us to achieve victory using the equipment he's designed for someone else. It's not your equipment. Saul's armor didn't work for David because it wasn't designed for David. Beloved, it's very possible today that we're losing battles, that victory has been slipping from our grasp because we're too busy trying to fit into someone else's arms and armor. We failed to attack because it could be a result of our neglection of our shepherd staff and the fact that we just haven't set out to gather the right ammunition. We haven't put on God's eyes. We haven't looked at the things that he's given us access to, and we haven't put the work in to get in those things and preparing them for battle. We've been fighting our battles, trying and using the wrong equipment, and discounted ourselves using the wrong standard of measurement. And we thusly believe we are powerless. And then we lose before we even began. You see, giants and God both know that we are powerless by ourselves. You see, the difference between giants and God is that God can render our giants powerless and then be glorified in our victories. Glorified when the very things that we've been mocked for, looked over for, shamed for, discredited, disqualified, and discounted for are the very things God uses and intended to use for his glory. Giants will disqualify, discount, discredit the very things God has equipped you with in order to disarm you of the very things that will bring about their destruction. They really don't want you to use those things because God intends to use those very things to bring destruction and to bring glory to himself. You want to be a giant slayer this morning? You see, this truth, the fact that God has equipped us with the tools necessary to bring about his glory, it reframes and it recontexts us the moment between David and Goliath. And Goliath's mocking of David and his equipment. You see, perhaps, just perhaps, what the giant saw was not a mere youth inexperienced in warfare. Perhaps what the giant saw was not a boy whose hands were untrained for battle. Perhaps what the giant saw was not inadequacy and incompetency. Perhaps he saw something entirely different in the lad's eyes. Perhaps he saw his own destruction. Perhaps as he sat there mocking the boy and his God, he come face to face with his own impending doom. Perhaps it was the first time he caught a glimpse of a fierceness, unfettered by his size and strength and unintimidated by his long-winded deception, unparalleled in the eyes of any warrior he had ever faced before, because of he whose hand was upon him. It was Goliath, beloved, not David, who had lost even before the fight began, because he set himself up against what God Almighty had put into motion. He lost because nothing stands in God's way. And what God establishes, nobody can tear down. Like David, we too can stare the giants standing in our way, opposing God and his promises, mocking our faith, are threatening our legacies, pointing fun at our shame and shortcomings. Like David, we too can see through what our giants try to get us to believe about ourselves, about God's promises, about them. You see, David is angered when he hears Goliath's words, and he says this in verse 26. What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? You see, David doesn't even dignify the giant by using his name. He refused to. You see, the dialogue here suggests a much harsher tone than what may be apparent. See, David mentions uncircumcised Philistine because he was making a strong statement about the giant's authority and about the giant's power over God's people. And later in this interaction, we read that Goliath cursed David by his gods. David knew full well that Goliath had no authority to do any such thing because God had already spoken over him and orchestrated a path that would bring about his glory, his promise, and his plans. That didn't matter what that giant said because David believed God's word. You see, David might as well have called Goliath a bastard. In fact, the book of Enoch refers to Nephilim as such. Bastards. They were the result of unholy unions and abominations in the eyes of God. They were illegitimate. They were illegitimate, and so they walk in illegitimacy in hopes of projecting it onto us, and on the promises spoken to us, on the plans before us, and on the purposes within us. Beloved, all giants are bastards. And we must remind them as such as we stare them in the eyes. And we say, you come at me with the sword and the spear and the javelin. And as you come at me and remind me of everything I don't have. Everything that I do not have as equipment. All the things I have in my shame. All the stuff I've done wrong. You come at me and you bring that to my attention. But I come at you in the name of the Lord of God and the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. You're not just mocking me, you're mocking my God and everything he has prophesied and promised. And that is a fight you do not want to pick. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, that there is a God in Paul's life, in Garrett's life, in Eric's life, in Steve's life, in Jim's life. There is a God fighting for us. And if God is for us, who can be against us? Amen. My favorite part here, beloved, my favorite part here. Now notice, at the end of this battle, after the big guy took a stone to the forehead. Now remember, Goliath was wearing a big helmet. And so that stone pierced his helmet and went right into his head. So that's some velocity there for you. Christ added a little bit of oomph to that stone, didn't he? So David then runs to Goliath. In some texts, if you read them, it suggests that David began to beat him with his stick. So he beats him with a stick, and as a final act, he picks up Goliath's sword and severs his head. You see, God used the very thing intended for David's destruction to bring about his glory, and he can do the same for you, and he can do the same for me. Do not be afraid, and do not be deceived into believing you are powerless, because you're not. Here's what we can do this morning. Stop discounting your equipment, your experiences, and your qualifications. God has given you access to the very things you'll need to destroy the giants in your life, though you may have to set out and look for them. You'll notice that David gathered 5 stones. And some might think he did this because he was afraid he was going to miss. I don't believe that. He gathered them because he expected to face more giants. Because the truth is, beloved, there's never just one giant. There are many giants. And the second part of that truth is they're not all there for you to kill. You don't have to slay all the giants standing in around you. Because sometimes you've got to move out of the way. Sometimes you've got to get your nose out of other people's businesses and stop trying to play their David to their Goliath. You need to let them step up. Let God be glorified in them. Move out of the way. In 2 Samuel, again, we read that David is in conflict with the Philistine army again, and he's hurt. And his men gather themselves around him and say, Lord, you must leave. You're going to get killed. And so David moves, and then his men slay the giants there present. Sometimes we got to get out of the way. But sometimes we got to prepare ourselves that there are more giants. Remember that the previous trials and testings that you've been through up until this day, look and see how God has brought you through them. God is present, always. Recall what God has revealed to you in the past, the things he's placed upon your heart to accomplish. What has God called you to do, beloved? What have you heard him say? What is the purpose he's placed within your heart? Be prepared, number 4, to give it your all. And be okay with being wounded. Sometimes wounds are necessary for victory. You see, it is impossible to do the will of God without being wounded by the will of God. It's impossible. Your wounds will then become scars that tell the victory story to your future generations. The will of God conditions as it cuts, as it carves away that which mars his image. But what happens is it becomes redemptive, and it becomes very real, even though it's very raw. Number 5, be aware of what you're fighting for. Your faith, it's your family, it's your future. And beloved, you are not powerless this morning.